These recordings will be shared in network and some will be shared with everybody. We'll see that coming out shortly. And before I move on, I'm also going to enable live transcript. So if that will be helpful for you as you're in the space, you can set that up yourself to be able to see the transcript of the session. All right, so we're on day 4, Wednesday, October 20th, Black and Natural History, and it's going to be a really fun night. Hopefully you've been able to capture some of the aspects of earlier. If not, you can check out our Twitter page for updates of what has happened and follow the threads, or our website pretty shortly. Before we move on, given natural history collections have historically and currently benefited from colonialism, we want to acknowledge the fact that specimens shipped on board slave ships to glorify empires and to promote exploitation, stolen objects, and so much more. The time for acknowledgement is long overdue. We must acknowledge that through our science, we have and continue to impact indigenous peoples. If you look at the chat and you might see some names, we are all based in different locations, from Los Angeles to Gainesville, Florida, and across the globe. These cities are traditionally territory of the Gabrielino, Tongva, Seminole, and Otimakua, and many other tribal lands. We want to acknowledge the space that we're on, given that we're in different spaces at this time. Now, it would be remiss of me to not give credit to the folks who've been behind the scenes. If you've been tuning in, there's been a lot happening, and it has been a really wonderful community to work with. So here you're looking at the organizational team. Each of these folks have been meeting sort of bi-weekly to plan what's been happening here for some time. And so take a quick minute to acknowledge their names here. We'll see them later on. They've also served as leads. Many of the folks on the organizational team have served as leads, leading on different days. So we're at day 4. So we have to back into time for a lot of what has happened. But each of these days has a team. Other members not on the organizational team. So Melissa and Jessica on that team, even though Jessica is also organizational member. So take a quick look. There's a lot of people behind the scenes making what you're seeing throughout this week occur. Now, with that being said, a couple of ground rules before we move on. Your videos, you can turn them on. Your microphones, you cannot turn them on unless you have permission to do so. But you can choose to show your video if you want. As noted earlier, we are going to be recording. So if you do not want your likeness to appear, you probably should leave your video off. If you're comfortable being on, you can turn it on. Now, if you've been Zooming, because we've been in a Zoomiverse for some time now, you've probably been using the raise your hand function. We are not going to be using that for this session. To keep things simple, if you have a question, we have a chat monitor, which will be me. So you'll see my name change to chat monitor shortly. And basically what you're going to do is send me a message if you have a question. And that is if you have a question you do not want to ask it yourself, you send that to me. That's option 1. If you have a question and you want to ask it yourself, send me a question mark and I will relay that to the moderator, which will be Janet, and she will ask the question for the folks it's addressed to. So to recap, if you have a question, option 1, you do not raise your hand, you basically send me that question. So if you want to know what color is the sky, you type it in, send it to me. I'll go over that shortly. If you want to ask Janet what color is the sky, send me a question mark and I'll let her know your name. And so essentially, if you've been Zooming, there's different ways to view things. There's going to be presentations and people talking. So depending on where you're at and what common screens you have, you can do gallery view or presenter view. For the view, if you look at your Zoom interface to the top, you'll see something say view. And that tells you if you want to see just me right now talking, I'm Adenia Fleming, pronouns she, her, and hers. Not showing my camera to make sure we save bandwidth. But if you want to see everybody else, you can see Alex and Janet and other people who have their cameras on, you can switch it to gallery view. To access the chat, because that's what you're going to use to send questions. If you look at your Zoom panel at the bottom, you'll see chat. If you click on that, it should pop up either as a separate box or to your right. And that's what you use to send a chat. If you want to send a chat to me as a chat monitor, you go to the blue box that says everyone. If you click on that arrow, you'll see chat monitor, click on that, and you send your chat to me. And lastly, if you're for the panelists, when you're speaking, only one person can speak at a time. If you speak with somebody, you will basically cut them off. So you might want to mute yourself if you're talking simultaneously together. All right, and then really quickly, code of conduct. We want to be respectful of space and everyone that is here. We're using IDIC3's code of conduct. I'll put this in the chat later. But the main things here, which repeats on the other slide, is we want to be mindful of 6 categories: discrimination on the basis of protected trait, harassment on the basis of protected trait, sexual harassment, retaliation, bullying, and any unacceptable behavior. If you do exhibit any of these, you'll see John Fralin here is our bouncer, and you will be kicked out of the Zoom. You'll be moved to the waiting room if it's not too severe, but if you're being really not nice, you will be removed permanently, and you'll miss all the goodness from tonight. If you do experience any sorts of those aspects discussed before, please email BlackInNHMs@gmail.com so we can make sure we can follow up and make sure you're okay. And you can also contact the moderator. And with that, really quick intro, so I'm like rushing through it, but hopefully everybody's aware of that. I want to pass the mic to Janet, and she'll get us started for tonight. Thank you, Janet.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to see everybody here. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm really excited for this program that we have lined up for you. We are being joined by a really fabulous group of scientists who have varying degrees of past and present affiliation with natural history museums. So first of all, we have Dr. Melissa Kemp joining us from UT Austin, where she is an assistant professor. And we also have Dr. Brandon Kilbourne, who's based at the Berlin Natural History Museum. And we also have Dr. Jessica Ware, who's a curator at the AMNH, and they will be our co-panelists later on tonight. And of course, our speaker for the evening, Dr. Alex Moore, who is currently a postdoc at Princeton and soon to be assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, is joining us by way of the AMNH as well, and will be sharing their research and journey and experience with natural history museums with us tonight. We are really fortunate to be sharing this space with these folks, and I especially want to acknowledge Dr. Kilbourne, who is joining us from Germany, where it is not a reasonable hour to be awake right now. So thank you so much for being willing to participate. And this evening, we will actually be opening the session with a poetry reading by Dr. Kilbourne. And what we'll be hearing tonight has been published in Ecotone. And without further ado, I will let him introduce the poem and take it away. Dr. Kilbourne.
Thank you, Janet. So this poem is entitled Natural History, the Curious Institution, and it's really about the link between the slave trade and using slave ships to transport specimens from Africa and the New World to Europe, and like sort of the early days of natural history. And so it opens with a quote from Kathleen S. Murphy. So here it goes. Natural history, the curious institution. We do not often think of the wretched, miserable, and inhuman space of slave ships as simultaneously being spaces of natural history. The collections of these naturalists bear witness to the deeply intertwined histories of the slave trade and early modern science in the Atlantic. Kathleen S. Murphy. 2 months to the Caribbean, our hold crammed tight, with cargo still breathing. In Lisbon, after 8 weeks in the bowels of a slave ship, samples of carmine and indigo, preserved scale insects, the dye's dried flower. 1,500 blocks iron ballast to steady our galley with Negroes loaded, whole plangent in rough sea strows and tortures. The right to sell slaves in New Spain accords with our grand scheme. Imagine the returns in American herbs, the cures and remedies. 11 of us tried to starve ourselves, but with a metal tool, the ship's surgeon prized our mouths open, pouring gruel down our throats. On picking up Jamaican fish preserved in spirits, I met strident abolitionists at the harbor. Yes, the treatment is abhorrent, but a civilizing yoke can only be best for the African. 20% of our Africans ridden off to the squalor below deck. Diarrhea, fever, change wounds, gangrened. Yesterday arrived a most diverse assortment of seashells in the hold of a new-built slaver. I detest the trade and pity their cargo, but science nonetheless must progress. 212 slaves salvaged while rescuing people from our Guineamen foundered amid reefs off the Swahili coast. While leaving the Bight of Benin, a squall downed the ship fully loaded, truly a tragedy. The crew and captain lost, along with specimens of rhinoceros, antelope, and bats. 64 slaves staged a mutiny. We held them with lead from our barricade, dispensing viperous man, woman, and child overboard. En route to New Orleans, the slaves, I learned, mutinied, escaping to some small isle. With deepest displeasure, I write that your malachite nodules are lost. 30 at a time, they rowed us out to their great and stinking ship. Our bodies then changed to planks stacked one atop another, coffin tight. Along with an array of dried leaves and seeds, my collector surprised me with a section of carved ivory, showing the heathen's fancy and hand at detail. 510, we marched them down to the shore. From the fort's white walls atop the hill, the chaplain come down to bless our ship's sailing. With the captain having lost on the journey, only 5% his Africans, and the safe arrival of these nests and eggs, we can both delight in a profitable enterprise. A dozen jetsam corpses to bait the sharks. We put on a show for the blacks, dissuading any uprisings with the terror of bloodied waves. Enclosed is an enormous snake from Suriname. A gentleman by the name of De Jong generously loaned me a troop of his blacks to procure the beast and prepare its skeleton. 301 of our number passing on with no return. And subsequent weeks' chains, the iron savored our blood and entered our souls. Upon stowing the chains for those wretches away, fill the hold with the sugar, rum, and cotton, and find some room for these crates, bones for some naturalist in Paris. 40 lashes to strike the back of that nigger, flashing a bold eye. Will not have him abuse our kind ration of sun and air above deck. 6 species named in the last years, all received through the safe care of the forts and their garrisons, the stock ships calling along the slave coast. 1 African wench-brained dead amid the crew's night whoring, 30 pounds her price, docked from their wages. The accounts of harpy, vulture, and sloth are remarkable, but the loathsome vessel for this knowledge bottoms on the question, are our morals to be the price of discovery? 132 sick and infirm, the defendants pitched to the waves. Dire straits did not impel them, but rather insurance. 5 skins of fabulous purple feathers. Having delivered your slaves to port, I trust bringing these and other articles back to Liverpool shall not burden you. 2 minds broken, one left, one right of me. Their every breath a well in the ship's dark, where vermin nipped and crawled over our shackled bodies. A simply unacceptable matter. 50% the butterflies gnawed down to tatters, no doubt from the vermin and filth home to that ship's belly. 3 children, numbers 8, 19, 46, we put into the thumb screws to force the betrayal of the Negroes that led the quelled revolt. Just this week, I cataloged my latest curiosities, crabs and corals brought by the Guineaman navigator from Barbados, vibrant in their color. 3,000 miles between Whydah and Salvador, countless the ocean's tears curling back to homeland severed. Having the captain as my guest over dinner, I extolled to him his role in advancing natural history. To our benefit, his contributions number countless. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kilbourne, for sharing that with us. It was really powerful, and for me, extremely emotional to think about the transport of our ancestors in slavery and how the people around them just saw it as business as usual and an enterprise and economy. But taking a deep breath and using that for the context of tonight's talk and later panel, I want to go ahead and shift right over to Dr. Alex Moore, who's going to share their research with us tonight. So Alex, if you can go ahead and get your screen shared. Okay, and I will let you take it away right away.
Perfect, thank you. I have no idea how to follow that, but I'm just gonna go ahead as planned. And so I will start with first just sort of thank you for introducing me. I wanna thank all of the organizers here for inviting me to speak today. And for all of you who are here watching, I appreciate that. So I also wanna thank you all for joining. And so my goal in talking today is really to share a little bit of the work that I do in conservation and education and the role that museums have played in that process for me. But I'm also here to just really share a little bit about myself and what it means to work in a lot of these kinds of spaces. And so with that, I'll give you a really high level view of some of the work that I do, and really we'll sort of go through this process together. And so to start with a little bit of background here, I am an ecologist and a conservation scientist by training. And so I work in wetland ecosystems. And so the map that I'm showing you here is a map of the global distribution of wetlands, where the green that you see represents the wetlands themselves, and then the blue represents different inland bodies of water. And so as you can see, wetlands are found on most continents across the globe, but it turns out that their boundaries and their definitions are really quite broad. So the simplest definition of a wetland is land that is wet. And so when you tell someone that you work in a wetland, it doesn't really narrow down the focus all that much. And so what I do in my work is I really try to zoom in quite a bit, and I work specifically in coastal systems. And so coastal wetlands can be grouped into these three broad categories. So they can be salt marshes, mangrove forests, seagrass beds, and these are found in both tropical and subtropical regions across the globe. They make up less than 1% of the total surface area on the planet, but they provide several different functions and services disproportionate to their size. And so some of those include things like being really important areas for biodiversity. They perform a number of different climate change mitigation features. So carbon storage is a really important feature across these landscapes. They provide a lot of food and water resources for local communities. Recreation and tourism economies are really big across these coastal systems. And then they also do flood and coastal storm abatement. So communities that live by these coastal regions tend to be relatively well protected by these natural ecosystems. So they're incredibly important, but they are also one of the most threatened ecosystem types across the globe. So we're seeing globally significant declines in wetland, and in particular in coastal wetland systems. There are a lot of reasons for it. Most of them are human driven. So shown here are just a handful of examples of some of the reasons why we're losing these landscapes across the globe. And so shown here are land conversion. So in the top left corner here, we usually take a wetland and convert it into something else. So the biggest ones right now are aquaculture and agriculture. We're also losing these systems due to their timber value. So you've got lots of significant timber harvesting, especially for mangrove ecosystems. Other impacts include things like climate change and sea level rise. And then the picture on the left here on the bottom of crabs is really meant to show important species. So if we were to remove a handful of different types of species across these landscapes, we can see some really significant shifts in the health and functioning of those ecosystems. And so given that we have all of these different negative impacts happening across these ecosystems, there's a lot of different efforts that are ongoing to help conserve and restore these systems, because we also do recognize that they're incredibly important. And so in the work that I'm doing, I'm particularly interested in the restoration perspective of these environments. So my big picture goals in the work that I do are really to take a system that looks like this. And so this is an unhealthy, degraded coastal wetland space, and then hopefully turn it into something that looks like this. And so this, at least visually, is sort of a healthy functioning ecosystem. So there are a lot of different efforts happening across the globe around conservation and restoration of these spaces, but it turns out we're not doing that great of a job at restoration across these kinds of ecosystems. And so the average values right now are that within a restored wetland, biodiversity and ecosystem processes are reduced by about 33% when you compare them to a natural healthy wetland that maybe hasn't been degraded. So we have a pretty significant gap in the level of function within a restored space compared to a natural space. We have a lot of different potential explanations for this. They include things like how big is the wetland, how long has it been since restoration has occurred, what's the environmental setting, what is the climate of the region. So these are all known variables to impact restoration success. But something that we don't consider very often, but that I think might also be important to consider in terms of why we're not seeing the kind of success we're looking for is in how we do restoration in the first place. And so this is just a really high level perspective of restoration. There's lots of actual different efforts and steps involved in the process, but a lot of the different elements that are incorporated into restoration efforts tend to really focus on these physical features. So really going in, removing whatever the disturbance is, so whatever caused the problem, get rid of that, and then focus in on making sure the soil is healthy, make sure you've got the hydrology flowing through the system properly, and then planting. So whatever vegetation is really important across that system, making sure that has been added back into the landscape. And that's usually what the main focus is. So really focusing on these physical elements with the assumption that everything else will just kind of come back on its own once we have the physical structure in place. But I think as we can all appreciate looking outdoors is that ecosystems are more than just their physical features. So there are a lot of different elements that can influence the health of an ecosystem. And some of those different elements might be important to consider in terms of how we approach conservation and restoration of these systems. And so in my work, there are two elements in particular that I'm really concerned with and trying to think about how to integrate them into our restoration practice. The first one is just thinking about species, right? So beyond planting vegetation across these landscapes, what are other species that might be found within these ecosystems and what roles are they playing within those environments? So if you were to take that species out of that ecosystem, how would it function? How healthy would it be? And taking that into account could be really important because it might be that some of these species are really important for managing the health and function of these spaces. So adding them back into that process of restoration could be a way for us to get added recovery. So that's one thing that I'm really interested in and really understanding that ecological perspective and how those different features might be really important for healthy ecosystem functioning. And so the other element that I'm really interested in is really thinking about the local community and sort of the cultural values, the uses, and the ways in which they utilize these ecosystems. How might those different factors be really important? And so shown here are just a handful of examples of things that are really important and relevant to local communities that live near these green spaces. And so this can include things like recreation and ecotourism. A lot of these different environments are sacred spaces for religion, for spiritual values. So thinking about sacred spaces or sacred species, they can be really important for education and science within the local community. So having those spaces as really good examples for kids in particular to go out in these spaces and really have hands-on experience, those kinds of things matter quite a lot. And then numerous communities have really significant, strong cultural ties to the landscapes in which they live and have lots of different traditions and practices. And so thinking about subsistence fishing, thinking about other cultural practices happening across those landscapes. A lot of these different features are important in terms of how that landscape has been managed for generations and the health of that landscape. And so it seems to me that it would be really important to incorporate a lot of these local community members, all of these local values in how we think about managing these landscapes. So not only thinking about the science, but adding in a lot of these other elements. And so when I think about my work from a big picture perspective, what I am actually most interested in is really thinking about how we can practice inclusive and equitable conservation. So most of the efforts that we see take place across the globe are really focusing on really historical Western scientific understandings of ecosystems and how they function and how we can best perform restoration and conservation across those spaces. And so that's only a really small subset of human knowledge, right? Western scientific understanding does not tell us the whole picture. And so I think that there's a lot more that we're missing that should be incorporated into some of the ways that we think about these spaces. Another thing that I think is also important is to recognize that efforts for conservation that are driven by external actors, so thinking about large scale international NGOs as an example, they tend to be less successful in their outcomes than those that are led by local communities. And so thinking about success as being a measure of both biodiversity and ecosystem function, but then also thinking about human health and well-being. And if you're thinking about both of those things, community-led efforts tend to be far more successful than those that are driven by external actors. And so we have to really think about our collaborative nature and who's leading a lot of these different kinds of efforts. And so in the work that I'm doing now and in the work that I have done historically, I'm trying to wed these two things together. So thinking about how do we review what our ecological understanding is and maybe go back in and ask questions about what we think we know. And then also, can we incorporate other ways of knowing? Can we incorporate other various stakeholders, various ways of producing knowledge, and having all of those different participants and actors be a part of that process to really do a better job of doing the kind of work that we're trying to do. Okay, so that is like a very quick and dirty version of some of the work that I am up to. And it would be pretty fair, I think, at this point, if you were asking, what does any of this have to do with museums? And I think that I've given you no reason to think that it does have anything to do with museums so far. And so what I actually want to do is take a really big step back here and then explain how I got to doing the work that I'm doing. And so for me, when I think about this and sort of where my journey started, sometime shortly after being born, I would say that my professional career began during my master's program at the University of Michigan. And so this was back in 2011. I started a master's program there in the ecology and evolutionary biology department. And so I was really handed a research project when I got there. It was my first real research opportunity. I'd never done work before. I knew I was interested in environmental science. I knew I was interested in conservation. And so I was given a project that really enabled me to dig into some of these different directions. And so at Michigan, I worked on a conservation focused research project that really was interested specifically in freshwater mollusks. So they are among the most threatened and endangered groups of species in North America. And so at Michigan, using museum collections, actually, this particular project aimed to identify a new species of freshwater snail using different DNA data, and then to propose protections given its small population size and its restricted range. And so shown here are just some examples of cone snails. The picture on the bottom left are the species that I was working with, sampled from different museum collections across the US. And so through this work, I actually was able to publish my very first paper. So that's the one shown there on the bottom right. And so as a product of doing the work that I did at Michigan, I gained a ton of skills. But one thing that I actually took away from this that was a really big impact for me was the recognition that I wanted to do conservation work at a bigger scale. So this work was really focused on the species level. And I think that we get a lot of funding and a lot of resources are available to do species focused conservation. But I wanted to do something that had a bigger impact. And so that was something through working on this project that I knew I wanted to take forward. And any kind of future work that I did, I wanted to scale up the role that I was having and the impact that the work that I was doing could have. In addition to that particular takeaway, something else that I learned through my time at Michigan was the importance of diversity being paired with inclusion and equity. And so at Michigan, I was brought into the EEB department through what's called the Frontiers Master's Program. And so this is a NSF funded program that aims to increase diversity in STEM. And so the Michigan iteration of this program brought in 4 or 5 students each year from marginalized backgrounds in the hopes that they would stay in through the master's program, get research experience, and then stay at Michigan in particular for a PhD. So they're really looking for retention. They're looking for matriculation of students from these historically marginalized backgrounds. And so I would say that for me, in this particular experience, it was incredibly isolating and marginalizing. So they brought 4 or 5 of us into this space, but there wasn't support or resources available for us to integrate with the other students in the department. There weren't easy access avenues for getting support or help in other kinds of contexts across our experiences at the university. And so in our time there, in addition to already being marginalized, it felt like we were being surveilled quite often, so monitored to make sure that we were behaving properly, whatever it meant to be a proper graduate student, proving that we deserve to be there alongside the other traditional students within the graduate programs there. And so short story is that it was pretty terrible, right? It was kind of an awful experience. But I persisted partially because I knew that I wanted to keep doing research and that I wanted to increase the impact of my work. But I chose to go somewhere else for my PhD because I also wanted to be somewhere where simply existing in that space didn't feel terrible. And so this may come as a bit of a surprise, and I certainly had different feelings later on, but that place for me ended up being Yale. And so I moved into a PhD program at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in 2013. It's now called the Yale School of the Environment. And in a lot of ways, when I started in my time at Yale, it was exactly what I wanted. I was able to scale up my research focus. So I was no longer focusing specifically on one particular species, but now really thinking about ecosystem level processes. And so I began working in wetlands. I asked questions that I was really excited about related to ecology and how different species might play different important roles in ecosystem health. And all of this was really with that larger focus of its potential to improve how we do conservation and restoration. So the real life application of my work was really important to me, and the tools and opportunities that I was provided and the research that I did at Yale made that connection really clear to me. And so beyond the work, Yale was also initially, at least, a space I was really, really happy to be in. They had a really obvious queer community, which was something that I was missing out on in my time at Michigan. I was a member of the Black Graduate Network at Yale, so there was a lot of effort to really find different kinds of community within that space. There were several different kinds of diversity and inclusion events and efforts constantly happening across the university. And so for a time, it actually felt like the things that I was missing at Michigan and the things that were really important to me were also important to the people that I was sharing space with at Yale. And so that was incredibly important. And in many ways, I would, for a period of time, would have called that experience quite perfect relative to what I had come from before. But as I'm sure is news to no one here, the more you spend time at an institution and the more you get to know an institution, the more you start to really recognize its flaws and a lot of its problematic histories. And so there are a lot of different things at Yale that were reminiscent of some of the problematic things that I had already really become familiar with as being really common across academic spaces. But I would say that for me, a lot of those different realizations culminated in this really one particularly big international moment where a Yale Black graduate student was sleeping in a common space in her dorm when a white student came in, accused her of not belonging in the space, of not being a student, and then called the police on the student. And so this escalated quite quickly. So the police came, and then the student had to prove that she was a student, but her ID was in her room. And it was like this whole thing. It was caught on camera. It became this really significant moment where Yale was being forced to reconcile with itself in ways that it hadn't been forced to do so before. And it was really, at least for me, at this particular moment where I had sort of decided that I was done, I think. Like I feel like I had given Yale and academia at large actually quite a lot of myself. And I had reached a point where I had decided I was kind of done fighting that fight. Like I needed to remove myself from the space. And I think that's actually quite fair to say when you've reached your limit and that you're done and that you're tapping out. And so when I graduated, I decided that I wanted to try something new, and I removed myself from the space because that was what self-preservation looked like for me at that time. And so for me, that new thing that I wanted to try out ended up being a museum. And so after I finished my PhD, I ended up at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where I did a postdoc for 3 years. And so as a child, I always really loved museums in the same way that as a child, I loved zoos and I loved SeaWorld. But as an adult, lacking all of that really blissful ignorance, I also knew better, right? I entered that space and I knew to expect to see things that I maybe wouldn't have imagined seeing in a younger version of myself. But I was also ready to experience a different kind of institution. I was ready to deal with a different set of problems and to find another way yet again to do impactful work, to increase the scale of my impact as much as I could again. And the platform of the museum, I think, provided me with a lot of the different tools necessary for me to be able to do that kind of work. And so in my time at the museum, I actually had dual roles. On the one hand, I worked through the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation, so the CBC. And in my time at the CBC, I really shifted my research focus. So I moved away from the salt marshes that I had worked on in my PhD into mangrove ecosystems, because they are understudied for a number of different things that I think are really important for us to be studying. And they also are incredibly important for local communities. And so recognizing those two different elements that are also important to me on a personal level, I thought it was really important for me to add additional focus to this kind of space that I felt like needed more attention. In addition to sort of shifting that research focus, though, I also was able to incorporate other things more explicitly into my work that had only ever really been implicit before. So the value of people, I think we tend to remove them from our scientific equations and the work that we're doing because they add complexity, they make things harder to understand. But I think when we remove them, we also are losing the reality of the situation. We're losing what it actually is like to be present across these spaces and to work in these spaces. And so in my work at the museum, there are a number of different people who were there as collaborators who were able to teach me how to thoughtfully incorporate cultural values and uses and local community members into my science, into my research, and value those things equally. So I would enter a space as a scientist, ask questions so that I could learn from people and not to enter the space so that I could tell people what to do. So really having a reciprocity and adding a lot of that element into my work was something that I was able to do through my time at the CBC. And so those skills have been invaluable to me and I continue to use them today. And so that was part one. The other part of my role at the museum was within the education department. And so here, and this was something I didn't mention before, I've always been sort of tepidly interested in teaching. And then at the museum, I was able to do a lot more of it with a variety of students at different levels of age groups. And that was great for me for a lot of different reasons. But I think one of the big things that I got out of it was the role that I played in being a mentor for students who came from marginalized backgrounds and have maybe never had access to these resources before, have maybe never had opportunities to do this kind of work before, and quite frankly, have maybe never seen a queer Black gender nonconforming instructor in their rooms before. And so I valued that responsibility quite a lot. And so in my time at the museum, I mentored several groups of students. I taught in after-school programming. I helped rewrite curriculum to really think about adding a lot of these layered histories into the science so that students can see the science for what it actually is and not the sterilized versions that we typically teach them. And all of that was incredibly important to me. And so this was my museum work, really thinking about combining my research, combining education, doing work with local communities, working with students. I was really incredibly busy, but I think that's just what New York does to you. And so in my time there, I was able to do all of these things, but it would be a lie to say that it, came without challenges. And so I think that there are challenges that are, at least here, inherent to working at this particular institution. And so I clearly can't go over everything, but I'm just going to highlight a few things that I think are important to bring up. So as one of the largest, or maybe the largest natural history museum in the world, AMNH was a place of really intense contention and conflict, both like internally and from a public perspective. So I'm just highlighting a couple of different examples here. So one is that on Indigenous Peoples Day every year since roughly 2016, the museum ended up being a place where massive protests occurred, where people are entering this space and really demanding that the museum take on efforts to decolonize itself, right? So recognizing a lot of that history that Brandon mentioned earlier, and really forcing the museum to think about it, to recognize that everyone's talking about it, and to see if it's able to move the needle at all. Other examples include the Theodore Roosevelt statue outside the front of the building, which I think is like maybe in the process of being removed, but someone asked someone, I don't really know where that has landed. But it's also one of those problematic legacies, right? We've got Roosevelt sitting here on this horse, and he's got these subjugated both African and indigenous men standing by his side. And so the calls for the removal of this statue have been ongoing. I think there has been an agreement put in place to actually get it out of the front of the museum, but I don't necessarily know exactly where that has landed. And then one other really quick example, which happened a bit later, is political, right? So thinking about what is the sort of political intricacies and relationships that are inherent to these kinds of institutions. And so one particular event that I remember happening was the president of Brazil was being hosted. So Bolsonaro was being hosted at a members only event at the museum. That didn't end up happening for a number of different potential reasons, but one big reason I think was because everyone was very upset with the decision to host this person in the first place, given what he stands for. And so these are just 3 examples from my short-lived time at the museum. You can imagine that there are numerous others for people who have a much longer history with these spaces and are maybe further invested and involved in the internal and upper echelon things happening across these spaces. But in the same ways that I experienced marginalization and othering and tokenization in academic institutions, I certainly felt it in my time at AMNH. But one thing that I think was really different for me here was that I was an employee at the museum, and the work that I did supported the success of the museum. And that was challenging for me for the first year or so of my time, because it meant that I was reconciling a lot of different things. I was asking myself a ton of questions, what does it mean for me to be an employee here? Does my employment here mean that I am implicitly supporting how the institution is run? Am I in my own self an actor in the ongoing oppression that the institution enacts? And so it was tricky. I would be lying to you if I said I didn't have a really difficult time that first year trying to figure out what it meant for me to work in that space. But I think I eventually got to a point where I recognized that there were trade-offs, right? I was doing this conservation work in a way that I thought was really meaningful. I was engaging with local communities that maybe otherwise would be ignored in these kinds of efforts, and really including their voices in the decisions that are being made and decisions they're being impacted by. I was being a role model for students who I can guarantee you never had met anyone like me before. And engaging with them in very personal ways and sort of helping them navigate their own lives across this ever-changing landscape. And in those last 2 years of my time at the museum, I was NSF funded. So I was no longer technically on the museum payroll. And that gave me a bit more flexibility in my decisions around the work that I was doing, the kinds of questions and critiques that I could ask and pose at the museum. Because they were not in charge of my rent payments, I could really be more, I think, critical of some of the things that were going on within that space. But I think overall, this sort of identifying that there are trade-offs in working in these spaces, and when I finally had that moment where I realized it, it occurred to me that I think we're doing this all the time, right? As people of color in institutions, as people of color existing in the world today, especially in the United States, I think that we are always recognizing that there are trade-offs in what we're doing, right? In every space that we enter, we are not the ones that space was made for. And so our existence within that space is coming with things that we maybe didn't want to have come along with them, but there are other positive benefits that are associated with them that at the time might be better or worth it relative to the other things that are coming along with it. And that's something that I think about a lot, is really this other sort of lasting question here of whether or not it is worth it, right? To be in those spaces, to do the work that we're doing. And I don't mean this in an unnecessarily critical way or in an unnecessarily glass half empty kind of way. But for me, I think it's always really important to be asking this question. So at certain points, it was no longer worth it for me to stay at Michigan, right? So it was worth it for me for a while, and then it wasn't. And so then I left. The same thing for Yale. I could have stayed on in a different capacity at Yale, but I had reached a point where it no longer felt good to me to be in that space, to be doing the work that I was doing. The trade-offs didn't feel worth it. And I kind of think that that's just a question that we are all asking whether or not we think we are across these kinds of spaces. Is the work that we're doing, is our presence in this space, does it feel like it's worth it to us? And so for me in the work that I do now, my answer is yes. I'm doing this work, it feels valuable, it feels meaningful. And the things that I feel like are against my ethic about the space that I'm in, I'm willing to deal with that as a balance to some of the other things. And that's not always the case. And so this is one of those things that I'm always sort of juggling in my mind, and something that I'm actually really quite excited to engage in conversation with everyone here today, especially on the panel, about how we sort of navigate this, because I think this is a tricky thing that we're all quite aware of. And that's actually just where I wanted to leave this talk. I didn't plan a sort of poignant end to this. It's really, I think this is a question that's always got an answer that's changing. And I would love to just sort of chat with everyone else here about what this means to them. But in terms of an attempt to close this, all of the work that I've done across those spaces that I've mentioned to you today led me to the work that I'm doing now. And I feel incredibly good about the platform that I have right now, about the work that I'm doing right now. And I wouldn't be able to do these things without having gone through these experiences to get there. And so for me, it was worth it to do all of these things. And the work that I'm doing right now is the work I will continue doing until it feels like I should be moving into something else. But with that, I would honestly just really be happy to take whatever questions people have, and then just chat with everyone else too on the panel about how we navigate these kinds of spaces and what are maybe some next steps we could be thinking about together. So I will stop talking and, be happy to chat with the rest of you all if you've got time for it.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was a wonderful talk. And it was a really good segue into the panel. But before we really jump into it, like Alex alluded to, if there's any questions that people have, please do enter them into the chat and we can start to pass those on to Alex so she can answer them, or they can answer them. I'm so sorry.
I'm noticing that there's so much that I missed in this chat.
Yeah.
Go blue.
Yeah, I think it'll be good fodder for the panel discussion. So no questions about the talk? Karen Galinsky says, I don't have a question, but want to thank you for sharing your experience. And I definitely echo that. I'm sorry, I have to gush a little bit right now. I'm so excited about how this event has gone so far. Like with the opening of that poem and you sharing your experience, and like everything has just been so much better than I could have imagined. And I'm typically a really introverted person. So I'm like, this gushing is uncharacteristic, and I'm going to stop talking before I embarrass myself. And we can actually just go ahead and move into the panel discussion because it doesn't look like people have any burning questions. So I'll invite Dr. Kilborn, Dr. Ware, and Dr. Kemp to unmute themselves. And I think a really good place to start is where Alex left off, and thinking about, is it worth it to be in these spaces? And when we're thinking about the context of the spaces that we work in, especially places like natural history museums that have a very sordid history, especially in regards to Black people and Indigenous people the world over. How do we reconcile our identities with our jobs?
I think it's a good question. And walking past the statue that Alex mentioned, as I do for my job, walking in buildings that we know were built by our ancestors. It is a challenge. Sometimes I've often, we've been doing a lot of work for a grant where we've been looking at museum specimens of insects. I work on insects. And, there's all of these labels on the dragonfly envelopes that talk about the expeditions. And I know that there were people that were exploited to get those specimens. In 1909, that dragonfly wasn't collected by Muller. It wasn't. Muller didn't collect that, It is a challenge for sure. But I mean, I guess I feel very similarly to you, Alex, that but not for the chance to be there, right? We wouldn't have been able to open our doors for all of the other people who are joining us. I feel like there's a lot of work that we do in the museum and kind of in science in general that is just physically being there, opening doors for people. Does make me feel like, okay, I'm not always going to be the only Black curator. I'm not, in 150 years, the only one, right? It's not always going to be this way because we're making, by just being here and by doing this work, we're kind of changing some things. But it is a tough trade-off, is what I would say. I agree.
Yeah, it's something I struggle with a lot. And in many ways, I try to think about it as reclaiming that space, the space that was oftentimes the buildings that we're working in were made by enslaved people, whether it was actually physically constructed from it or enslaved people were forced to mine the rock that was used to create a building. The specimens that we're working with, whether it was enslaved or indigenous people guiding those collectors to finding them or doing the actual collecting. We don't have those stories. And one really powerful thing about today was learning the names of some of those people that, a lot of them I didn't know about really until we started preparing materials for this event. But if I think about this space that I occupy and the fact that there have always been Black people in this space, many of whom are unnamed, I use that energy to kind of guide me in the work I'm doing. And like Jessica said, we're opening doors for people. And as our ancestors are, initially opened those doors for us and made a foundation upon which we can do this work now. So I try to think about those people who are there. And, it's a very abstract feeling, I guess, because in many cases, I don't know the names of all of those individuals. But I use that to kind of guide me and motivate me to continue doing the work, especially during those times when I, question whether it's worth it or not. And that's a really hard question that we deal with a lot. And I often think the work I'm doing is worth it, but you sometimes get messages from external forces suggesting that maybe it isn't.
Yeah, I guess if I'm gonna chime in, the question of whether it's worth it, it's difficult, right? Because because with the poem I read, what inspired it was reading a science article about the link between slave ships and that I think came out in 2018. And my entire training as a scientist, I knew about colonialism and I could kind of figure out, okay, this specimen's from Africa, so this was probably brought in colonial times, but the whole slave ship issue never discussed in my training, right? So it's just something like this giant missing gap that I wasn't even aware was missing. And so it was like there's just so much that's almost kind of a curated forgetting about history, especially how it pertains to Black people and people of color in the story of natural history. And I guess for me, it's a bit hard to grapple with, how, because I want to know more about this history, but is this really almost like a curated forgetting in a way? And I'm not saying that necessarily anyone today as a curator is in some sort of conspiracy, but I mean, just over time, that's kind of what's the net result has been. And so, I think being there for people and sort of opening doors and being an example is important, but I guess it's also a struggle because it kind of, in some ways, you feel a little bit afloat because you're not knowing this greater history that's kind of just been swept under the rug, right? So, yeah, it is something hard for me to balance.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and we can keep talking about this, but a lot of the things that everyone has touched on so far are things that I've struggled with personally as a person working in these spaces, but also as someone who will soon be entering like a leadership role, becoming a PI. And I think about, you know, the fact that I'm recruiting people like me to enter into these spaces, even though I don't feel 100% comfortable being in these spaces. And I know deep down that like it is not always the most welcoming or healthy environment mentally if you belong to a certain marginalized group. And a lot of the things that Alex and Brandon and Melissa and Jessica touched on play into that. And so I've often struggled with that. Like when I recruit people into my lab, into academia, into museums, into universities, all of these spaces that were meant, built, designed to exclude them, how do I protect them? Or how do I support them in the best ways? Or how do I help them navigate that space that I've barely learned to navigate myself? And so that is something, that is one of those things, to use a cliche, that keeps me up at night.
So, I mean, just to speak to what you're saying, Janet, I feel like once I got tenure, this is maybe part of the system, is it's not totally great, right? But I do love the fact that I have tenure because it gave me a lot more freedom to speak out about things. And thinking about, I actually talk about laying awake at night. My goodness, I think about some things that happened before I had tenure that I didn't feel like I could speak out against, or I worried I would be retaliated against. It's a haunting feeling, and it's very distracting. I mean, it's not like you think about it every minute of every day, but it's a distraction. And then all of these distractions pile up. It's remarkable that any of us get tenure at all by all these other things that you're managing. But then as soon as you get the tenure, I think it's really important for us to use our voices to be as loud as possible in our institutions.
So I want to just go ahead and interject some questions from the audience. So the first one is from AJ, and they're asking Dr. Alex, how challenging was or is it to be non-gender conforming and Black in the places that you've worked in?
Oh, it's a weird question a little bit, because it just is like the way it's always been. So it's not like I have a way to compare it to like some time where that wasn't the reality. I think that I would say, I'm dividing this question up a little bit in my mind. Being gender nonconforming has never been difficult for me in workspace because it was something that I think never presented as an issue for me in my experiences with people. I think being Black is the first thing people notice. And so that has always been the thing that I think I lead with in a space. And that's the thing that I think has maybe led to the most challenges and the most difficulty. And I think that in terms of like manifesting, like how it manifests, I think it's different for everyone. Like, I think for me, like I tend to be a quieter student, right? And so oftentimes it seems like I'm not interested because I'm not boisterously raising my hand and I'm not actively excited in a way that a typical student would be, right? So that's a thing, right? You get dinged for that, for behavioral things like that. You get dinged for being casual in your language, right? Like how you speak, how good is my English, right? So that's like another thing that you get hit for in terms of communication. I think that some of the biggest issues that I've experienced, so if I were to give a short version answer to that question, is really just how it's really easy to notice when you were the only one in that space, and that feeling doesn't go away, right? Like you always just sort of like recognize that you were the only one. Someone else might also be noticing that you're the only one, and you don't really have a space that you can go to that feels comfortable and safe. So you're always sort of on edge, and you're always sort of like ready for something. And it means that you can't just be relaxed and learning. So you're always doing the extra work to make sure you're safe before you can also do the work of like learning and being a student. And I think that that has always been the thing that frustrated me the most, was like recognizing that I'm jumping through these hoops in my head, realizing that like I'm the only one. How should I talk to this person? Can I walk up to that person? How are they perceiving me in this space? Like, you're doing so much work just to be there before you can actually like do the work of just being a student or do the work of just being a researcher. And that's just exhausting. And so I think that I would say that how it's manifested for me is that I just feel tired a lot from doing all of that. But yeah, anyway, that's like, I could honestly talk for days about it, but that's how I would say it has sort of manifested for me.
Thank you for sharing that. And the person who asked the question also said thank you in the chat. So moving on to the next question, how, for the whole panel, how do you balance the aspect of your colleagues, white and other non-Black people of color, being oblivious to your experiences as a Black person, having to shoulder more of a burden because of your identity working in museum spaces? I'm thinking here about color blindness, like the I don't see color.
I don't know, I'll just give a really short, I think, answer, because I don't want to take up too much space. I've gotten to a point in my life where I decide I don't want to be around people, right, anymore. Like, I can just say, oh, if that's the kind of person you are, there's no changing that about you. So I will occupy my space with other people who I don't have to do that kind of work with and for. Other people, I think, are more gracious with their time than I am at this point when it comes to things like that. And so if it's also really easy for me to differentiate, like, I'm just here to work with you, and I don't need to like you or be your friend and like communicate with you about a lot of these other things, unless we're already meeting in the middle on something and like in a space of shared learning. It's not something that I tend to engage in all that often. Again, it's a self-preservation thing. Like, we've got too much other stuff to do. So that's me, at least.
Brandon, did you want to go first? I didn't want to jump in.
Yeah, I can go. So I guess for me, it's a little bit like just kind of in a way phasing it out, like as best I can, and just trying to plug on sometimes. I mean, to paraphrase a quote by James Baldwin, there's I don't remember the exact quote, but it's to be Black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. And so in a certain way, I think to sort of, like, as Alex mentioned, like self-preservation, you just get by and get through the day. When these things happen, you just kind of have to power through it, although it's draining, when things happen. And I mean, I can think of, like, I don't know if it's like, let's say color blindness, but kind of like making excuses or just not wanting to see a situation that's happened. Because I can think of one time in a course where the instructor basically gave a racist seminar about the intelligence of Black people. And, I'm with all my peers and friends in the course. When it's over, I'm just like livid, and I'm complaining to one of my friends, and he's like, no, he didn't mean it like that. No, you're taking it the wrong way. And it's just like, he spent 90 minutes saying, Black people are racially inferior to white people. So it's like, well, how else can I take that? And so it was just, I don't know, I have dealt so much with color blindness, but I guess sort of this denial of just outright situations. And that for me has been really draining when it happens. And I just, you just, I guess, kind of like try to plug on as best you can. But yeah, it's, at the end of the day, it just takes a lot of energy when this happens.
And I think too, maybe we've all kind of talked about the feeling maybe of isolation, and that makes it harder, because I think for me, I can remember incidents in high school, incidents in university, incidents in grad school, incidents when I was a postdoc, incidents in my first job, and every time I would think, is it me? Like, why is it that these things keep happening to me? Is it that I'm a difficult person? Is it that I'm not a nice person? Is it that I'm not easy to get along with? And it actually took, kind of making a community of other scholars of color to say, the red thread that ties it together is that academia is racist. That is the red thread that is tying it together. But in my mind, I was worried, what if I'm the red thread that's tying it together? What if it's me? What if it's that I'm, antagonistic because I don't like jokes about, Black people having sex with animals in my genetics class? Like, what if that's just me? So I think maybe as we talk about these things, in isolation, it really can get in your head and make you really start questioning yourself. That's exhausting too. So the more we have community, I think that is, I'm not sure if the question was looking for an answer or a solution, but certainly having community, having spaces like this kind of is reaffirming. It kind of makes you feel like, okay, whew, there's some systemic things that are beyond my control, and it does take a bit of the pressure off for those of us who tend to worry that we're the problem.
Yeah, I think community is extremely important. I have, chat threads with my friends and colleagues where, if something happens, I will, summarize the event and just ask, is this me? And these are people who have had similar experiences, and, we just validate each other. I think that's really important, because if you don't have that community, like others have said, you're just sitting in your, own space, isolated, and, thinking that something is wrong with you. And then in terms of, shouldering burden, in terms of, maybe being asked to do more service and try to right these wrongs that other people have done, people from the majority group. I've learned how to say no. I'm still learning how to say no, but I choose what activities and ways I want to engage with what those are going to look like. And then if it's not something that's going to be sustaining to me, if I don't see it as being fulfilling, I say no. And if there's pushback about that, I try my best to get out of that conversation. I'll often bring up the other stuff that I'm doing, and I'll be pretty blunt about it. And that seems to work as well.
Okay, we had another question from the audience. Going off of what Brandon said, being that it's important, but how do you balance that being there? How do you balance being there while being tokenized?
Yeah, that's a good question that I don't exactly have an answer to, because I do feel that it's kind of a double-edged sword. Like, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm tokenized, but I also realize I'm kind of the only person here. And so if I do step down, there's a vacuum in a way. And I guess being in Germany's been a bit weird in a way where, I guess given Germany's history, some people are very sensitive about not tokenizing people and this or that, but they don't really know how to talk about it. And so they will say the exact opposite of what they mean. So, has led to some very big misunderstandings of what their intentions are in talking to me. And then only me realizing later, oh, they actually meant that not in an aggressive way or not a hostile way. They don't know how to talk about issues of race in a way that's, I guess, constructive. So all that, I guess my situation being here in a foreign country, that adds to the situation. But I don't really, I guess the thing is, try to build a community or try to find like-minded people or some sort of group for yourself. That maybe you're the only person in your institution or your department and you are tokenized in that way. But if you have a greater community in your city or in, say, you're not the department, but the whole university or museum, it does help take off some of the burden because people can relate to you and what you're talking about. But it is something very hard to balance.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think community is gonna save you in a lot of different, like, answers to, I think a lot of questions will be find community, because I think that that's just gonna be something that you'll find a lot of support in. I think one thing that has also been really helpful for me, especially with regard to the tokenization, is I like to think about my like work relationships as being transactional in some ways, where I recognize that you were getting this from me because I'm in this space. And so I will try to get as much, if not more, from you as possible from the institution, right? Like they're full of resources, both financial, both intellectual, there's tons of stuff. And so for me, it has always been about getting every single penny possible to be able to do the work that I want to do, right? Or to be able to engage in the communities that I want to engage with, or to be able to teach in the ways that I want to teach, or really being able to leverage all of the things that they have for the betterment of both myself and the communities and the students that I'm working with. And if that means that I am tokenized in the process, sometimes I'm okay with that trade-off, right? Which is not the same as saying I'm okay with being tokenized, but is, I think, the same as saying I'm getting things out of it that I think are worth this particular experience that I'm having. So, but also community, super, super, super important. So those are the things that I think have really driven my mentality around spaces with things like this.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add that, and this is not advice, so I just want to qualify this, that the longer I've been in academia, the more vocal I've been about people making me uncomfortable. And I've kind of been mean about it in some people's view. And so when I've been feeling tokenized, or I feel like people are taking advantage of my identity to push an agenda that I don't necessarily want to push, or I don't think is, basically, if I don't agree with the message, but you're trying to use my voice or my image or anything about me to push that message. And it could be something as simple as recruiting to a space that I think is toxic. And I'm like, I don't want anybody who looks like me to come here, anything like that. I tell people, and I'm like, you're being abusive and this is not something that I want to be a part of. And that is something that's been extremely difficult to learn how to do. Like I said at the beginning, at the opening, I'm an introverted person, but related to something Brandon said earlier, the quote that he mentioned, like to be Black in America is to be constantly enraged. Pretty much when I become enraged, it's like the shyness and the introversion is just out the window. And at that point, I'm just like, you guys are being jerks. And that's had to happen a couple of times. And I'm not sure how much it helps. I don't know if people actually then go and reflect on the things that they've done to make me respond the way that I did. I think a lot of times what I feel is happening is that people are just reacting to my reaction and not thinking critically about, well, why was she so upset? Why did she react that way? What did we do wrong? And even though I'm saying all these things and I don't know how helpful they are, it helps me not to internalize it, to just give it back to people who are trying to give it to me. And it also makes me feel better to know, well, at least that person doesn't have the excuse that I didn't say anything about how I was feeling, or that they didn't know that what they did made me feel a certain way. So it's a little bit more reactionary, but it has increasingly been the way that I've maintained my sanity. So.
I would say that I've really varied my responses depending on the scenario. So, there have been times, like Alex mentioned, where there was a trade-off and it seemed like it was worth it. There were other times I can remember I had a student that was concerned that they had gotten into a program because of their demographic profile. And we kind of talked about it at length. And I kind of was saying, and your peers are not worried about this. They're walking in here with their head high, your chin up, and their hands swinging, right? Ready to go and do the work. So like, this is a burden you don't need to put on yourself. And after telling, him this, I thought I should take this advice for myself. And I should really, because I was always worried the job that I had before I was at the museum, many people in the faculty, which should have been a red flag, told me that I was hired, that they recruited me because of my because of the demographics that it brought to the department. Should have been a red flag. But then there are times like what Janet's describing where it can just become so toxic that it actually, I mean, that, like, I put a quote in the chat about the Audre Lorde said, all that you touch, you change, and all that you change changes you, which usually I think of in a very positive way, but it actually, yeah, I changed that department, but it changed me in a very negative way. You know, I didn't like having to always be filled with a state of rage. And so at some point you have to ask yourself what you're willing to do and what's your life. You know, if this is your life, if your life is constantly this, you know, for some people that's fine, but maybe, but for me it wasn't, you know, yeah. So, you know, I guess you have to figure out what your boundaries are and where, like, at what point the line is totally obliterated and you have to find something different, even if it's scary.
Since there's like a little bit of a natural pause here, I just want to check in with folks. I know it's now 8:12 on the East Coast. So how are our panelists doing? How is our speaker doing? Are you guys okay to keep going? Should we wrap it up?
I'm good.
Yeah, it's not 2 a.m. where I am, so I'm also fine.
Okay.
I'm fine.
Okay, and from the audience, are there any more questions that you'd like to ask our panelists? Sorry, I'm checking the chat.
While you're checking the chat, Janet, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Jessica.
I think that, like, I just wanted to hold space for the fact that it's so unusual to have other Black people in natural history museums, and we're all talking to each other about something, anything, all in one spot. This feels really special. So thank you for organizing this.
Yeah, and thank you for everybody who's participating. Like, it's definitely a team effort, and I'm so glad that I was able to get people together for this tonight. Did anyone else want to share any from the panel? Like, is there anything that the panelists want to talk about tonight for the next topic? Oh, okay. There's a question coming in. The person's still typing, so I'm just waiting for it. Okay, so Adani is asking a question. She says, I'm really enjoying the conversation and the need to build community. Can you share any thoughts or suggestions about building community given the vision and goals of Black and Natural History Museums?
I think I don't mean to just jump in, but I was just going to jump in and say, I think that now we're kind of in a special time right now where people seem to be paying more attention than they did in the past. And now's the time to ask for a budget. Because community, I mean, you can do community for free, but now's the time for us to ask our institutions for a budget so that way we can get additional work done.
Anyone else want to chime in about like strategies for building community, how to find community, maintain community across institutions, within institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of depends on like where you are a little bit and like your career stage and what the setting is. I know that for me, like if I'm thinking back to my PhD, like there were a number of different like Black focused affinity groups on campus. So getting involved in those. Actually, my best friend, one of my best friends, we met because I don't know, I had posted something about needing a roommate on Craigslist or something, or some like Yale focused board, and he wrote in and he was like, I can't live with you because I'm allergic to cats, but can we be friends when I get to Yale? And I was like, sure. So like random things like that can be really useful. We also like had organized what we called Black Lunch, where all of the Black science students that we knew in the area just came together and had lunch together. every week. And so like there are small things that you can do that don't feel like a lot of effort and work to build community. And then there are the bigger things, right? Where you organize a group yourself, or you try to get a grant to put something together and have that be institutionally supported for years, into the future. So there, I think that the spectrum is quite wide, but certainly as like bare minimum, use social media, like see who's where and like reach out in advance. I want to say more often than not, people of color will be happy if other people of color reach out to them to like chat and connect. And so I think that there, you can do low hanging fruit versions of trying to find community, or you could do really, things that require a lot of intense effort, but it's not impossible, but it is all work, right? So you have to still always be willing to do a little bit of labor to get those things, if those are the things that you want. But yeah, so those are some of my, I think, suggestions and examples.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Jessica. I'm gonna pop in real quick because I was like, I could actually ask a question, like get a little more clarity in it. So basically, I was thinking about the fact that like I was loving the community aspect, because basically we're here because my hope was to build community amongst Black people in naturalist museums, because I was tired of being the only one, the one of in my spaces, and having to like burden and show a lot of the things that you all spoke about. And so I asked the question thinking about, seeing where we're going with this week. I was just wondering like if you all were like, I don't know, envisioning like, ooh, I would love to see this or that, and like having like next steps for like Black and naturalist museums, because if you are not aware, we're doing this week, but it's just a start of, as we discussed, like something bigger. We have a nonprofit set up, and so the idea is to really continue building community. So I think I was thinking about the question from an aspect of like, given especially the conversation tonight and the conversations that we often don't have, and the fact that we are able to like have these now and use our voices and stuff like that, any tidbits and tricks and tips for like, I don't know, next steps as we're building? We have plans, but I want to know, like, I want to still pick your brains for a second and be like, is there something you're like, oh, you should make sure you do this, or like blah, 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 blah. I'm rattling on now, so I'll pause and stop there. Thanks.
Well, I guess no one necessarily wants to have more Zoom meetings, but I think we a lot of us are, isolated in the spaces that we're in. I know Jessica made a comment earlier about, being the only one in spaces. And, I have this habit of when I go into a room, the first thing I do is I count the Black people there. It's just something I've always done because I'm usually the only one. But this week has really, brought attention to, the fact that there are more of us. And we are distributed all around the globe. And if there are ways we could use Zoom and other, video conferencing platforms to maybe have spaces where we can connect and start building community that way. And then, if there's a conference, those of us who are going in person can meet there as well. Or if I'm in a city, I can contact someone. I think that would be a really great way to help build the community, because I think we're, building momentum right now. We just want to make sure that we're sustaining it in the long run.
Thank you.
Any others want to add or share to that last question?
Well, I can talk maybe a little bit about just building a general community here in Berlin. And so I guess in terms of the topic of this sort of, human history of natural history, if that makes sense. I guess I was lucky here that there's a humanities department within the museum, and basically these are historians and sociologists in it. And so like through them, I have, colleagues who are more interested in this topic, kind of this forgotten history of natural history. And that's been really, great to have, this sort of other interest of mine, tied to my ancestry that I can talk to other people about. And they're genuinely interested in it. And they really want to recontextualize collections in terms of this human story, this human history. But then, there's been, that's kind of very, I would say almost passive way, because they're just there, they're my colleagues, and we meet and we talk. In terms of a more formal thing, there's kind of been a grassroots organization developed here in the museum. It's just, we call it the Anti-Racism Working Group. And it was basically after George Floyd was murdered that different people in the museum came together and said, we want to see an anti-racism statement. And, the museum, not to go into the whole story, was dragging its heels a bit. And so we kind of came together, we organized, and we discussed things, and try to, how can we push for change and this or that. And so that was kind of brought about by current events that we came together and we kind of found a like interest amongst different people in the museum. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's how it's worked out for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
So relatedly, there was a follow-up question from Miranda Lowe asking, talking of community, do you all connect with Museum Q, which is the US version of Museum Detox? Which I don't know if Miranda wants to unmute and explain what Museum Detox and Museum Q is, but that might be helpful.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's late here. Sorry, I'll put my camera on. Oh god. Yeah, you can see me. Hi. So Museum Hue was co-founded by Monica Montgomery and Stephanie. I can't remember her surname. But they started. Hi, Adania. They started, I think, a little bit, or maybe around the same time as Museum Detox. So I'm one of the co-founders of Museum Detox in the UK, which is a network supporting and doing activism across the cultural and heritage sector in the UK. And so there are about 500 members now. Since 2014, we started meeting at a traditional English pub, which is really interesting because you don't get a lot of Black people going to pubs in the UK. So seeing us all gather in the back room, I remember, the regular customers seeing us all go in there for our meetings. Yeah, there were a lot of looks. So Museum Hue, run by Monica, is a similar version, working across for all people of color, but across all different types of museums. So I just wondered if some of you as individuals that are part of that group, but I've met Monica many times and we've had chats about our two groups.
Thank you for sharing, Miranda. I actually wasn't aware of Museum Q. I had seen some stuff about Museum Detox as we were organizing Black and Natural History museums, but I didn't realize there was an American equivalent.
When I visited the British Museum, actually Miranda and I had lunch, and Miranda told me about, we talked a little bit about Museum Detox, and it really, it was intimidating going into the British Museum, and it was intimidating being there to give a talk. And, again, kind of like this space, being able to talk to people with shared lived experiences was really, it's very transformative. And so I can just give a thank, just all, like I say, unmute myself all the time just to say thank you. So thank you to Miranda, because this, that was really helpful. And I think all of the work that you're doing is so transformative.
Okay, any other concluding comments for the night? Well, we're almost 30 minutes past the hour, so I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. And I want to say once more, thank you so much for participating in this discussion and attending Dr. Alex Moore's talk. I've had a really great time tonight. I'm taking so much away from this program and this community and these series of events. So do please continue to engage with us for the rest of the week and in the long term as we continue to build the organization. And please do share with us any information that you have about historical and contemporary folks who are Black and working in natural history museum spaces. We would love to hear about them and to celebrate them and to bring them into the folds and find that community that we've talked about a lot tonight. So with that, thank you everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and I look forward to interacting with you in the future.
Right, good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks for the invite. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much. Nice seeing
Bye,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.